Welcome everybody, and brave coming. We've just been talking about how people in Brisbane, like it's raining and so everybody's grumpy and staying home and whatever. My son's soccer match was cancelled to the night, which is a bit of a blessing, but we're all here and you're here, and that's good. So we're glad you're here. Just to introduce myself first, I'm Phil Brown. I'm the senior writer with the Brisbane News is my title. I'm not that old, but I am the senior writer with the lifestyle magazine Brisbane News. And as I say, that doesn't necessarily mean I've got a lifestyle, but that's what I do. Any Brisbane News readers here, we hope? Oh, good. Good. Excellent. Excellent. That's right. You'll get your money on the way out. Thank you. Why am I doing this evening? Good question. Glad you asked. Because I was asked to. And when I was asked, I don't think anybody realised that I had my own flood background. And I've explained this to a couple of our speakers. I was born in the town of Maitland in the Hunter Valley. I don't know if you know Maitland. Just after the great... Well, I was born in 56. My parents met in Maitland during the Great Flood of 55. If any of you have seen the movie Newsfront, you'll recall people rowing down the street, and we'll get to rowing down the street here later too, but rowing down the street of Maitland, it was a major flood, and my father was building a bridge across the river, the Hunter River. It got washed away, huge disaster, but he met my mother. There you go. So that's my flood story. So we've got flood stories in history from Noah on, haven't we? So, and of course, recently, we've had our own experience of that. I think we all forgot about it from 74. I was living on the Nerang River on the Gold Coast in 74. We had water that far from the house. So we're lucky we haven't been. But of course it's been very traumatic for a lot of people, and the recent floods of the summer of 2010-11. And of course, if you've seen the exhibition downstairs, you will have sort of relived that. But up here we have, curated by Helen Gregory, this extraordinary exhibition about the floods of, and floods is the operative word, of 1893. The great floods of 93. Now, I should point out that none of our speakers were alive then. But they do have strong connections there through their kinfolk. Let me just introduce them to you, and you've been introduced by name, but we have Peter here, Peter Clark, who's the great-grandson of H.C. Stanley, the designer of several bridges, or the one?
The replacement bridge from the 1893 flood.
Right. He replaced the bridge over there in that painting, which was washed away, and there's also a picture of the bridge there. So Peter's well versed in the flood law with the bridge connection there, which we'll talk about in a sec. John Hockings is the great-grandson of A.J. Hockings, who was mayor of Brisbane, not once but twice. He has his own connections to that time. Of course, they lived through the flood. Our family home was destroyed in the flood, and we'll talk about that in a second too. And Tony Love, and of course the name Love is well known, Isles Love and Company Auctioneers, and Tony's the grandson of James Love, and James Love wrote reminiscences of the 93 flood, which Tony has memorised and will recite tonight. No, he won't. He will talk about that and some of the reminiscences of that time. And so they've got these very strong connections to this time and place, our place, but a time when history was repeating itself, as it does. And as you look around the photos here afterwards, it's gobsmacking. But it's wonderful because it gives us a way into looking at that, what the city was like then, what life was like then. So as well as remembering the flood, we get to learn a little bit about the city. So just tell me, to start with, Peter, in your family folklore, is the flood story and the bridges, is that, I mean, you're obviously an engineer, but so you're interested, but is it a family, is it something that you've talked about in the family? Is it something that you've just come to know?
Well, my mother used to talk about it when she was alive, and being young, I'd say, oh, there she goes again. But as I grew older, became an engineer, I realised there was some significance in all this. And there was plenty of stuff written about it. And eventually I tracked it all and became very interested. I tried to pass it on to my 3 daughters who are nowhere near being engineers.
And the beauty, it's still there at the bridge that you're...
Still in use,
yeah.
And it was designed judiciously for the sort of higher loads that they encounter on the railways now, and it's still in service without any upgrading in terms of strength. As far as I know, that's the way it's been.
Tell me, what do you know about your great-grandfather? Just a little bit of a snapshot of him as a person.
Right, he was born in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and when his father, who was an artist in Edinburgh, he died, and so the family migrated. There were something like 6 or 8 children. Most of them came with the mother and came to Queensland. So Henry...
What year did they come?
They came in 1860.
Yeah.
And they were parishioners at St Paul's Church in Ipswich. And so the first 4 children were born in Ipswich and were baptised in the church.
Is that a Presbyterian church?
An Anglican church.
Anglican church.
And so they then moved eventually to Brisbane. He was by then with the railways and was appointed chief engineer of the Southern Western Railways at the time of the construction of the bridge that was washed away. So he eventually became chief engineer of the total railway system in the early 1890s. He would have been overseeing probably about 2/3 of all the railway systems developed in Brisbane, Queensland, up till the turn of the century.
And the floods would have had a devastating effect on railways and other transportation at the time.
Yeah, not just in southeast Queensland, but I think there are quite a few. Stanley did a lot of bridges.
Yeah.
As far right through Queensland.
Any others that we might know of in the district?
There's one there, the Macrossan Bridge, way up near Burdekin, on the Burdekin. Another one, Dickabram, which is quite an unusual bridge. But Professor O'Connor has dealt with most of his bridges in his books.
Oh, okay.
So there are quite a few of them about still surviving.
Yeah. So did he leave any kind of written, is there any correspondence or anything about the time? I mean, for example, when the floods were happening and in that time, what was happening to the family? Were they affected personally?
Well, no, he lived at Tyna Brewer, which is the house next to the railway bridge, which was then taken over by the army.
Yeah.
And he was living there when all this was happening. So he was able to direct all the safekeeping measures on the old bridge, which eventually didn't work, even to the point of putting a ballast train on the upstream line to try and balance it out a bit. But by the time all the houses and all the debris and the force of the water and the scouring action took place, then the bridge was doomed. Nothing he could do. But in terms of the effect on the family, no, I'm not aware of any direct effect.
No. When the other bridge was washed away, we noticed in the painting here there's some people going across the river by a little punt. Was that there as a method of transport as well, or because that was a railway bridge, right?
That was a railway bridge.
So that was the regular way people got across there.
People could walk on the gangways on the bridge to cross. They didn't have to wait for the punt.
Oh, okay.
The punt was driven by cable.
Yes.
And it would carry vehicular traffic across.
Oh, would it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it was there. In fact, the tracks down to the old punt are still there, visible on the Indooroopilly side.
I don't know that area of the river. What's around there now, around the river banks and nearby to the bridge?
Well, that's
what do we know that's
fairly
nearby?
good value real estate there down the side.
Indeed. Yeah.
And if you come back on this side, there's the Indooroopilly shopping centre.
Yes, right.
And the Indooroopilly pub.
Yeah.
Do we see Tyna Brewery, the house there, just to the left of the tree?
No, I don't think that's it.
But that's about the location of the house.
It is around roughly a bit to the left, I'd say.
Yeah.
Well, I'll urge you all to examine that afterwards because it really, and it's a lovely painting. As Peter points out, however, he is an engineer after all. It's not entirely accurate, the bridge. But the idea of the bridge is there, and a little bit of poetic license.
Good artistic license,
Yeah. And of course, your great-grandfather designed a pretty sturdy bridge, if it's still there.
Yeah, still there.
Yeah, that's pretty good, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, he had a proof check by Professor Warren in Sydney University, who was an eminent engineer at the time, and he agreed with Stanley's design, asked for a few modifications, which Stanley implemented, and finally described the bridge as the best example of a riveted truss bridge in Australia at the time.
Well,
So he was quite impressed with it.
And there's a pretty good, strong tradition of Scottish bridge building, and I don't know if I shared with you my knowledge of the worst poet in the world, William McGonagall. Has anybody ever heard of William McGonagall? He's a Scotsman who wrote a lot of poems about bridges, believe it or not. The Great Tay Bridge, he wrote a poem in praise of the Tay Bridge, and then he wrote another poem when the Tay Bridge fell down or something called the Great Tay Bridge Disaster. So bridges they're very important things to us, aren't they? Let's talk to John for a moment. John Hockings, the great-grandson of A.J. Hockings. And I said he was mayor. When we were talking on the phone, you know, you have a question when you're on the phone, and if you're a journalist sitting at your computer, you just ask Google, the great oracle. And it popped up that A.J. Hockings had been mayor twice for over 2 stints with a little gap in the middle. So I'm not quite sure of the politics of all that, which would be fascinating to look at. But the connection to the flood is in a couple of ways, isn't it? Now, one involves the house being destroyed, or
no,
partly washed away.
Yeah, damaged.
Damaged.
Yeah, but particularly the nursery, which I might talk about.
Yeah. Tell us about that, and then also, please, if we can, then we have an artefact here that was saved from the flood, which John's going to tell us about also. So, had enough? Oh, good.
Okay.
See, that's the beauty of being up here, and we can research as we go. So thank you, Helen. So,
Okay,
John,
so
tell us a little bit about A.J. Hockings and his relationship to the flood and what you know of it.
Okay, I'm a little bit of an interloper because we didn't, in the family, talk about 1893 floods at dinner every night.
You will in the future.
We will in the future, that's right. But my great-grandfather was A.J. Hockings, my grandfather was E.M. Hockings, and they were both dead before I was born. So they existed when I was a child, just about in the kind of Neolithic era as far as I was concerned. They were kind of ancient relatives. But there was this book floating around on the bookshelves then, just around the house, which is it's got a cover on it which says the Acts of the Parliament of the Colony of Natal, 3rd Session 1905, and then in the cover inside it's a lecture given by A.J. In the year of 1861, and it's called the Recollections of a Cruise amongst the South Sea Islands in the years 1845 and 1846. So as a kid, having this thing here and talking about the South Sea Islands just conjured up all kinds of fascinating images. And then at the bottom of it is a note that says, rescued from the Brisbane 1893 floodwaters. And that, again, just added to the appeal of that little book. So that was my kind of idea of these floods, was that they were connected with this book, which was connected with this beautiful 70-foot brig called the Sarah Wilson, which was my great-grandfather's sister's first, both her Christian names.
Was he a trader? Was that
he came to Sydney first of all in the 1840s, and he was very much interested in horticulture. Bought this ship, sailed it around the South Pacific, gathered a whole lot of plants. It was sort of non-politically correct days, so all those people were interested in things that could be grown in the colony, and he had basically an import and export business with a fascination with horticulture. He came up to Brisbane, set up business here, and he had his wharves pretty much where this building is. And he built a big house called the Oaks in Hocking Street at West End. The next street down is Jane Street, his sister, and then became Pioneer Concrete and Hume Concrete later on. Eventually they pulled the house down, unfortunately. But it was a beautiful old house called the Oaks. And when I first spoke to Helen, she told me the story that added to the whole fascination of...
She knows
AJ
it all.
Hocking. She does, yeah. Apparently AJ with his family, and there were two houses and there were a lot of brothers, so I think between those two houses there were pretty much probably 3 or 4 families inhabited them, and he'd built big nurseries around the West End house, really extensive nurseries. He was involved with the setting up of the Botanic Gardens and all that kind of stuff. But they were on holidays down in Redcliffe, and so I'm guessing that was probably the early in the year, first kind of February floods rather than the mid-year ones. There was some commotion down on the beach, whether it was Redcliffe or Woody Point, I'm not quite sure, but one of those beaches. They went down to investigate. There was a bunch of people making off with a bit of flotsam and jetsam that had washed up on the beach, and when they got closer it had the Oaks written on it, and it was their big front gate. So if you want to know where all the stuff from this year's floods went, it goes down the river, around the corner and up to the beach at Redcliffe, which was just a lovely story for me because both my parents died about sort of 5 to 10 years ago, and of course it's only when all that happens that you start to really get interested. The questions that you could have answered just over dinner suddenly become incredibly difficult.
Now, coming here tonight, you've seen, a document from a family member.
From the granddaughter.
Tell us
of
about
AJ
that, because it's over there under the glass.
Was a woman who was known as Auntie Nell in my family, Eleanor Elizabeth Bourne, who was the granddaughter of AJ Hockings, I think one of the first, if not the first, women doctors in Queensland. And the Bournes were again, they lived at Clayfield, we lived at Ascot in those days. When we were very young kids, we used to go over to the Bournes, and they were part of the kind of mystery of all those family relatives that you have and spend every weekend driving from one side of Brisbane to the other to visit them. But I knew the Bournes, and particularly Nell, was a really intelligent woman and fascinating woman. And there's this lovely notes of hers that are recollections of the Oaks and the gardens around there that I've never seen. And as I say, you get interested in that. Every day, if I Google AJ again, as you did,
Yeah.
they're putting so many newspapers into digital formats now that there's another 20 entries with AJ Hockings of another voyage of the ship or an advertisement in the paper for something they're selling from his shop down in Brisbane or that kind of thing. So you almost get too much information these days, and it's a matter of trying to sift through it to get
Is the book? Sorry, just tell me what's in the book. By the way, is it the ship's journal? Or?
No, it's not the ship's journal.
No.
It was a lecture that he gave. I think it was to the Mechanics Institute, just to get the engineering connection there again.
About his voyages,
which is a recollections of the voyages to the South Sea Islands.
Extraordinary.
And they went basically sort of Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, that direction and back.
Well, he wasn't eating it or anything, so that's good.
No. And you look in you do these googling in the paper, and you see this lovely advertisement: Sarah Wilson brig sailing to the South Sea Islands, 2 cabins available, blah blah blah. So suddenly you start to get an image of what it was like in those days, and there were ships coming and going, and you could go off on these adventures. Now, I just think my grandparents and great grandparents were so adventurous.
And I did establish that he wasn't a blackbirder.
No, he
when you
wasn't
start
a
talking about
blackbirder.
people trading in the South Seas around that time, you start to get a bit suspicious of some.
Yeah.
But I'm a great lover of the books of the short stories of Somerset Maugham, who travelled through the South Pacific, but probably a century after that. So it must have been quite extraordinary.
I spent a few years in my early post-uni days living up in the islands, and all the boats I've ever owned. I've just finished building a wooden boat last week. They're all called Sarah Wilson. So
Oh, how extraordinary. That's lovely.
It sort of sticks in your mind. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just a nice attachment of these grandparents that I could never know because I never saw them living, but you bring them to life.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Now, Tony, your grandfather, James Love of Isles Love and Company Auctioneers, he left us this reminiscence in writing about that time. And I haven't read it. You have? Can you tell us a little bit about his reminiscences? Because to have that sort of first-person recollection of the event and surrounding the event is priceless. So,
Well, my grandfather died before I was born. He died in 1941. But my ears propped up, John, when you referred to A.J. Hawkins of having been an adventurer in the Pacific. Only last Saturday morning did I arrive back in my boat after 5 weeks in the Pacific.
well, when I first tried to contact you, they said you were at sea, and I wasn't sure in what capacity.
But I've tended to follow my grandfather around, doing lots of similar things, having been a third generation in that family business. But
You were sailing your own boat?
Yes.
Fantastic.
But James Love was the youngest of 5 children of the Reverend James Love, who came to Brisbane in 1863. He was the Reverend James was a Presbyterian clergyman who family annals record had a disagreement with the elders of the Presbyterian Church over a matter of doctrine, and soon was working for the Church of England as a pioneer pastor, and was the rector of St Andrews at Lutwyche and latterly Holy Trinity in Fortitude Valley. But James was the youngest of 5, as I'd said. My father was the youngest of 5, and I'm the youngest of 3. I was 40 years, and my dad was 40 years and 2 days older than me. So that's why we've got 3 generations spread over a long time. James Love went into business in 1889 as an auctioneer. The reminiscence record that he was dissatisfied with his prospects as a clerk or a bank teller in the Queensland National Bank, and among our annals, I think indeed it's now in the hands of the Oxley Library, was a letter from the manager of the National Bank, 308 Queen Street, which described him as being an adjectival fool and would soon be back looking for his job. So he went into business as an auctioneer with J.T. Isles, who was of the Finney Isles family of the department store. And it appears as though that 1889 was not a good time to have gone into business, but I suppose as auctioneers there was some merchandise to sell, and they did it. At that stage, all the auction houses were in fact run by the pawnbrokers, so there was no true commission agent, and nobody could sell goods without reserve for true market value, and that was their philosophy, and indeed it had always been the philosophy of our business that you can't be a punter and a bookie, so to speak. But coming to the flood, in fact, James was like, I was reading Major Maddox's recollections there about the flood, and I think Major Maddox must have been the portmaster or something like that. But the thing that was common with all of these, that they really had a beautiful command of the prose.
Yes.
And they could write very descriptive, colourful prose, because they were all at that stage time. They were all students of the liberal arts. Many of them were keen on music or poetry, as James was. And so the reminiscences which my dad had often referred to anecdotes out of were in fact written in 1927. So they were his recollection of the flood 38 years later.
Okay.
But nevertheless, written with with quite an eye to detail, being quite economic about the use of words, so it wasn't flowery. But if I can just share, and I'm sorry I didn't bring my copy of the Reminiscences with me, but it
resides in the Oxley Library, yeah?
It is, yeah. It's in the Oxley Library. But referred to his story of the flood was how he was living at Toowong at the time and got a message that the city had been inundated and there was a need to go to look at some merchandise in a shop which would have to have been sold by auction. Because when he arrived there, well, the story goes that he got in his dinghy or borrowed a dinghy and got out into the swirling torrent and got to town in no time. Observations of when he rode past the house of Doctor, whose name escapes me, he referred very particularly to the snakes which were all curled up in the wrought iron veranda. Then so he hitched his dinghy up to the hitching post in front of the office and had a look at this particular shop, which the door was still closed, but he could see merchandise floating around inside. He referred there so that must have been a quite fit young man, and he referred to how he swam up Queen Street and round into Edward Street to have a look what was going. And amongst our collection of early photographs particularly the flood collection, there are a couple of really interesting ones where a couple of or three men in a punt in Queen Street near the corner of Edward Street, and they had a sign that they were floating a new loan. Boom, boom. He then referred to his journey back to Toowong, which was not as quick because there was a bit of current, but how he rode up the railway track.
Yeah.
And on the way he happened to hit a fence post and put a hole in this dinghy. So he mentioned the name of the household, and he said, but then I borrowed some linoleum and tacks from so-and-so and patched the dinghy and then proceeded to row home. But it's recorded on a number of references here how the economy in the years that followed the flood were very dismal indeed. As indeed I recall I went into the agency business in 1970, and I remember the 1974 flood and how crook business was for a long time after that. And indeed, the city of Brisbane has been suffering economically the effects of the flood. And it's referred to elsewhere, the history of the earlier floods, how following the flood, whilst it might have replenished the aquifers and the primary producers have had good times, those in commerce really have had quite ordinary times thereafter. But just going on with the Reminiscences, there are some other interesting anecdotes about various other activities that the fledgling firm did carry out in terms of the sale of land subdivisions all over southeast Queensland.
Now, one of you was telling me, and I can't remember who, was it about the real estate? Somebody was trying to sell real estate after one of these floods, and they were asking what the holes in the ground there. Who was telling me that?
Yeah.
Was that you, Peter?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This was at Chelmer.
Yeah.
My great uncle John Cannon lived at Chelmer on the high ground, but down towards the Chelmer Reach on the western side of where he lived, there was a lot of inundation on housing estates there. And some years after the flood, he went down to see what was going on. A few people crawling around, and they were asking what are the holes in the ground here, these circular holes. And much to the irritation of the real estate agent, Uncle John said, that's where the stumps were.
That's not a good selling point. Back to the Reminiscences for a moment. How lengthy are these Reminiscences?
It's about 24 pages of typed foolscap.
And does he say what his raison d'etre is for what prompted him to chronicle it all those years later?
Well, I think that they were all historians in those days, and as evident from the collections here, a lot of people then were collectors. He was a great collector of photographs, and so our family photograph collection is now with the Oxley Library. I just think that it was in their mind to chronicle things. What led him in 1927 to sit down and type 24 pages, he probably thought, well, I'm a little bit older now, I should record some things.
Yeah.
And this recorded his, a lot of his business philosophies, about ethics, about business practice, and a lot of them they were all based on anecdote of people he dealt with. Whilst it's not relevant to the flood, the one that I was brought up on where grandfather was selling paintings in the auction mart, and he said that there was a photograph or painting of a stately building in England, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I do believe this is a painting of Buckingham Palace." Just as a throwaway line, and there was an English voice said, "Pardon me, Mr. Auctioneer, point of order." He said, "That is not Buckingham Palace. I've been there on many an occasion." Without a hesitation, he flicked a half-crown coin and put it in his eye like a monocle. He said, "Sir, I'm sorry." He said, "This is the front entrance."
Very good.
So they were very quick of wit.
Yeah.
And I think they were obviously all great raconteurs.
Yes.
And as I think as is evident when you can see, and I'm referring to Major Maddox's work, that they were quite descriptive and really got you in there, and you could experience the circumstance of being there.
Well, you say that some of that's not directly related to the flood, and I hope you don't mind me just throwing to Helen for a moment, because we have the historian here with us. Where is Helen? There she is. And one of the things about, and there's Helen there. She just put a hand up. She's quite small, but she's one of the things about an exhibition, curating something like this, is the theme is the flood, but it tells us a lot about the people, the life, the city then too, doesn't it? So it's a foil really for looking at, oh gosh, you knocked that over. It's a foil for looking at how people lived there, and I mean we can see what the city looked like, how different the river was. Is that something, when you're curating it, is that a part of what you're doing?
I really did want to do that. As well as having the story of what actually happened, in the sense of where was flooded, where was not, what was destroyed, what was left intact, is that I wanted to bring it through the stories of the people who lived through it. And as well as that, you talked a lot about reminiscence. Reminiscence is recollection. It can sometimes be interpretation. So it was also interesting to look at the way, for instance, a painter like James Lawrence Watt, that we were talking about before, interpreted the flood, what the poet said, what the novelist said, so that it became a story of the impact on people and then the way in which they lived in their city at the time and afterwards. And I was particularly struck by a couple of letters, one of them's in the exhibition, from a fairly recent immigrant writing back to England to try to tell people what had happened to them since they'd gone to the promised land. So there were a lot of new people in Brisbane in the 1893 flood after a very prosperous decade, a little bit similar to the decade before the 2011 flood, where there were a lot of new people who hadn't experienced this kind of really unkind weather.
Let's just be specific about the 1893 flood too, because it was floods, wasn't it? It was a terrible year. Tell us how many and when.
Well, the thing about this was, I grew up, as I think a lot of people did, hearing about the 1893 flood. And it wasn't until I really got active in research in Brisbane that I realised, in fact, there was no one 1893 flood. There were 4 floods in one year, 2 severe, 2 not quite so severe, but if they happened tomorrow, we would still think it was a nasty flood. And they followed fairly closely on
Mm.
And then even the government, to put back the infrastructure that was destroyed, were in a far more difficult situation than comparative times afterwards.
Yeah. Thank you, Helen. Go to the top of the class. And hopefully I hope we're allowed to tarry for a little while afterwards to have a look at the exhibition, because it really is, it's a wonderful companion piece to the one downstairs, which is quite interactive and shows you all what's happened, after the recent flood, with some great footage of 74 and so on, isn't there? Yeah. It was my senior year at high school, and actually, a small anecdote, it got me out of a bit of a hole, the 74 flood. It's a terrible admission. I had my mother's car, and I was inebriated and smashed it into a sign in Surfers Paradise, and but it was the flood meant I couldn't go home, so I didn't have to own up for a couple of days, by which time I'd concocted a story of what happened, and nobody ever found out. It's a terrible thing to do, but the flood.
It's all recorded, I'm told.
And
I'm not sure what the statute of limitations is.
No, well, I shouldn't have said anything, should I? But yes, so because of the flood and everything, the damage to the car became minor because of the flood. So there are other opportunities for floods too. You were telling me, Tony, about the auctioneer. Was that après the 74 flood?
Well, the 1974 flood was interesting because at that stage in the game we were running a general auction business, and we did, after the flood, we did a lot of salvage auctions of all sorts of flood damaged merchandise, and there's one very significant company which is still in business here, but they had a large amount of hardware merchandise, a lot of which got damaged, but when we relocated it all to the ground floor of a wool store and set it out in lots, it was amazing how much of this flood damaged stock had dry cobwebs on it. So it was seen as a marvellous opportunity to have a really good stock taken clean out at the insurer's expense.
Flood damage must go.
Yeah,
so yes, there are opportunities, and and of course, I mean, there were some unfortunate occurrences, I think, in après the last floods, and some people take an opportunity to capitalise on that.
Yeah.
But any of you directly affected by any of the floods? The 74, the last one? No.
No, my brother, to keep the family history alive, unfortunately sold his house in Toowoomba, moved to Brisbane, bought a piece of land that obviously had round holes in it, but he was flooded within 4 weeks of buying his new place. So,
How badly flooded?
Up, a two-storey house up to the first floor, that kind of badly. So
shocking, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. Going right back to the 1890s, I'm sure that the family nurseries would have been completely devastated by 3 or 4 floods in a row, and at a bad time, as you were saying. They were relying on selling those things, and they're hard to recoup.
We lived we live at Wooloowin now, but we lived in a sort of lower area of Wilston during the last flood, and we were of course thrilled to hear that during the 74 flood the old lady next door was taken out in a rowboat, and so that didn't make us feel too good. So we put everything onto our upper level, and we vacated for the night. And I remember going back there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that eerie afternoon when we're all waiting for it, and it didn't come there because the creeks weren't flooding.
Yeah.
It was just the river. But so we sort of felt this terror, lying awake at night, waiting to hear the water lapping. It didn't happen for us, but visiting some of the areas that it did happen, in the coming weeks. And for Brisbane News, we went out and spoke to some people. And when you go over to, I guess it's Chelmer and those areas, and shocking. And when you hear, the human cost afterwards, which expresses itself in any number of ways, from the sort of financial aspects to the personal aspects to marriage breakdowns, all sorts of things can have that terrible effect. And obviously 1893, probably the same sort of thing.
Mm.
But, you know, why do we keep living here? Why do we keep on keeping on?
I mentioned earlier that I just finished building a wooden boat, and I started building it in my backyard at Paddington. I'm fairly high up in the hill. I'm in November, and a lot of neighbours, after the floods, did start to wonder if I
What
knew
does he
something
know
about
that we don't know? So the family histories, are you still probing?
Oh,
The
yeah.
three of you, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And these things sort of encourage it, I think, because
Yeah, once you start, it's on.
Yeah.
Mm.
I was interested too, Tony, you were telling me there was... Now, which was the poet of the Loves?
Okay, well, that was James. That was my grandfather, James. One of his other interests, as I've referred to earlier, that in those days, they were students of the liberal arts, and James was a very keen poet.
He had a wonderful pseudonym, didn't he?
Yes,
A pen
well,
name.
Yeah, he had a pen name, Oracle, which is O''Racle. And when I delivered to Diane Byrne his poetry jottings, which I'd found at home and I'd previously had restored by the Commercial Archives group of the library, and it had a copy printed on archive parchment, but all of the originals had been washed and enveloped and put in a buckram box. I presented the original to Helen, and when they found out who Oracle was, quite a few pennies fell into place, because they knew who all the other poets were, but they didn't know who this fellow was. But he was a buddy of Steele Rudd.
Yes.
And
Arthur Hoey Davis.
Steele Rudd used to publish a periodical of poetry. And I understand whether grandfather alone or others, but I think Steele Rudd didn't have very much money, so they used to finance the publication of his poetry journal. And so amongst that collection that's now with the library, there's really a lot of fun.
He didn't write any poems about bridges, did he?
No, he did, but one was, because we probably all know about Thomas Wellesby, who was an historian of Moreton Bay and had written a collection of books, and the thing that in common that James Love had with Thomas Wellesby and indeed me, we're all past Commodores of the Royal Queensland Yacht Club or Yacht Squadron, and so when I was asked to take on the role as a flag officer, following in grandfather's footsteps, I just didn't hesitate. But there was a lovely a poem, an ode to the bay that Oracle had written, but it was written for Wellesby, and that was a piece that I was able to include in my father's eulogy.
Did you tell me that he wrote some poems that were like business-like poems, or about real estate, or something like that?
No.
What was you were telling me about
talked
something?
About, yes. Well, in terms of marketing of property, he said, particularly when they were selling up the farms in the Desert District, they subdivided Tabragalba, not as principal, but because you could see all the land in those days was sold on terms, because banks would not lend money on undeveloped on land without improvements on it. So if you wanted to sell your land, you had to carry terms. And it was interesting to see the lithograph, the red one over there, how there was, I think, 5% or 10% deposit and the balance by promissory notes, whether if it was at 3-month or 6-month rest, there were different interest rates. But if you paid it all in cash, it was a 2.5% discount.
Yes.
But he said that in marketing land, you had to more or less create the picture, and he used to write poetry about it, because he said in those days they didn't publish photographs. He said so you had to paint a mind picture. And if I only had the reminiscences here, I could quote the poetry that he'd written about Tabragalba, of how it was just beautiful, descriptive.
It's just unusual, yeah. I mean, there's certainly no poetry in our real estate ads in Brisbane.
No,
News, but
well, be careful, I'm a retired used land salesman. And I take it the round holes, but yeah, it was all really a lot of fun. But he said that you had to make it interesting for the reader, and that's why he referred to versification. And it was just, I think it was just all lovely, lovely literary endeavour.
Yeah, that's nice. Thank you for that. Now we're coming towards we're at the point where we're going to allow you to ask some questions, and I just wanted to ask you if any of you were affected in the floods in 2011, though, first, 2010, 2011. Anybody? Yeah? House damaged?
Yeah, I actually live in Wellesby Street in
Yes.
Newcastle.
Ah, there you go.
Wellesby got flooded as well. I believe.
No, I think the river house, because it's just up on that rise.
And the water in Wellesby Street came up through the drains, you know,
Yeah.
so there was all of that discussion. But I remember when a high-set house was about a metre through the place, but it was the old fella down the road, you know, and it's like that memory of what's the community memory of where the water came from, and he's in his 90s, and he was like, oh no, I'm staying, you know, he knew where it would come to, and why his house was a bit higher than everyone else's. And then another woman up the road going up there, you know, on the day just after having cleaned, and she'd lived through it in 74, and she was sort of desperate, and but was sitting, and she said, I was so sad last night, but I looked up at the old Duchess up to the house, and I thought, she's been through 3 floods, I've just been through 2. You know, so I think the memory in the, you know, how do you, and I think that was one of Helen's points with the exhibition, how do you keep the memory of floods and natural disasters alive in a community while in periods of drought where water, you know, it just is such an abstract notion. So I think the importance of telling the stories, of keeping the memories alive at a family, at a community, at a state level, that we do have that knowledge, we just don't know how to tap on into it.
We have a question at the back here, or
Yeah, just on the point about Tom Wellesby and where the flood came from.
Oh, good.
Yes, it did come not quite to the floor level, and being the recorder that he was, he made a mark to hand on the story of where it came to. So it's part of the kind of detailed paraphernalia of the house, like the compass rose in the paving near the front steps and so forth. There is actually a flood mark.
I don't know whether he. I don't know whether the flood was referred to in any of his literary works, though. Because they were really about his time down the bay. And at Stradbroke Island.
One of his writings does refer to one of his beautiful yachts that was a casualty of the 1893 flood. And he writes very sadly, almost, not as though it was a member of the family, but the way you write, your beautiful dog had been drowned. It was that kind of very reflective, I don't mean hyper-emotional, but sad, very reflective about...
I could understand that because I have a very platonic relationship with my boats.
any other questions? Did you? Here we go.
Just I was going to make a comment. My parents got married in the mid-1940s, and my mother's father bought a block of land, and so they went around looking all around this leisure area, Taringa and that area. And every time they look at the block of land, it's no good, 1893. so my mother's very, very aware of it.
How did they know about the 1893 levels? They'd studied it, had they? Or?
I'm not sure.
Is that
Father
the-
would-
that-
grandfather would be-
that map? on
That
the-
map there,
Yeah,
yeah.
He was very, very conscious of the 1893
Mm,
that was in the mid-40s.
And I think it depended a lot on the part of Brisbane you were familiar with.
Yeah.
Having lived at Graceful in the 1974 flood, there were people there who were very flood conscious.
Mm.
And so it went back, you know, where other floods had come. And the 1931 flood was a big topic of conversation in those parts as well.
Mm.
So I think perhaps it has currency in some parts of the city where if you lived on the heights of Albion, well, it probably would mean nothing much to you.
Mm.
It intrigues me as well, like if we're thinking back 100 years, and we do have this habit of marking floods in a way that you can't do with fires or other sort of natural disasters. But I wonder in 100 years' time, with the kind of global warming and rising oceans, whether the whole flood story mightn't become a really different kind of one with a whole other level of marking, because it's there's just something really intriguing about the relationship with the water, the sea level, how cities are formed, why they're where they are, and if you suddenly start to change that, it's
Well, the question I ask when I look at this exhibition is, what the hell are we still doing here? I mean, you know, we've just, and then you forget. Time passes, you forget.
Yeah.
A question that I have is, did you record the 2011 floods like your ancestors did in any way, shape or form, knowing the impact that now your ancestral records have had?
We weren't in Brisbane at the time, so no chance.
Where were you?
Up the Sunshine Coast.
Oh, yeah.
Couldn't get back.
Well, mercifully, I wasn't in Brisbane. We were in Tasmania in our boat, indeed, up in the Gordon River. We're at the point where the Gordon below Franklin Dam was to have been built. So we were out of radio range, telephone range, every range.
He's always out on his boat when you...
Well, that's what you've got to do. I mean, you've got to go adventuring, but
How big is your boat?
43 feet.
Yeah. So when you, on your recent journey, because I had these messages saying I'll be in New Caledonia or I'll be in, I thought you might have been the captain of some sort of cruise liner.
The reason for us being in Tasmania was that we'd raced this boat in the Sydney to Hobart race.
Oh, my God.
Then it had always been on my bucket list that I wanted to go into Port Davey and then into Macquarie Harbour and up the Gordon River and find a piece of human pine, which we did.
Okay.
But then...
On your recent journey, who accompanies you on these journeys?
Oh, well, Namur was a race from Brisbane to Namur, and then we cruised for 3 weeks there.
Well, there you go.
so-
Well, there's a link to the South Seas adventures.
that was another adventure. So I
Yeah.
dare say AJ would have no doubt gone to the Isle of Pines.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been to the Isle of Pines.
And you probably find that he might have even brought back a load of sandalwood from New Caledonia too.
I had a marking or a memory of this year's flood because I was up in the Sandy Straits. We have a fishing shack. There's a few fishing villages up there. We call them drinking villages with fishing problems. But we were stranded for 12 days, I think. I'd watch the news, and I hope no one comes from Jindalee, but there were lots of people complaining about not being able to go shoe shopping for 3 days or something because they seem to have been ignored out at Jindalee. And after 12 days up at Poona, I rang Maryborough Police and said, there's no shop here. Is anyone kind of going to do anything about getting your food down? And
Running out of shoes.
they said, They said, well, no, can't you sort of drive up to Maryborough? And I said, well, there's about 40 flooded creeks between us and Maryborough. So, that was our family's now got another memory of that flood. We weren't, and we weren't harmed by it like my great-grandfather was. But it is intriguing how there are different histories and different stories depending on whether you're in capital cities or out in the country where you just make do, a bit like, patching the dinghy with
the linoleum
linoleum and on you go.
It was a nice touch at the end of our flooded period when we did return home. We live on top of a hill which is certainly
Good
flood-free.
thinking.
Our insurance company straight after the flood wrote to us and said, you're automatically covered for floods. Oh, that was
and we're
nice.
putting up the policy by back and forth.
Well, there's some terrible stories going on about premiums. Helen,
Well, just thinking about John's story of finding the Oaks Gate, or his grandfather finding the Oaks Gate on the deed. A few weeks ago, I was asked to give a talk at the Wynnum Historical Society about the exhibition and the floods. And there was a very elderly man there, and I told that story of A.J. Hawkins, and this man came up and said, if you came for a little drive with me, I'd be able to show you a couple of houses that have been built of recycled flood stuff that was found on the beach. Believe me, it happened here too. And apparently, one of the houses with the recycling from the 1974 flood. So that's an interesting thing. It does have a different meaning in the Bayside.
yeah, well, that's where it all ends up. Yeah. Well, that's, as you can see, you start talking about the flood and you start talking about all sorts of other things as well. So it's interesting, isn't it? So, but I think we've come to the end of the formal part of the evening, and I know I've got to go home and have my dinner. So, please thank our guests for sharing with us, and thanks for coming. And I've got to ferret out that reminiscences.
Yeah,
And
as I recalled, I think I have it on. I have it in soft form somewhere, so I'll go searching tonight, Phil.
yeah,
So if I can have your email address, which
yeah.
I've got somewhere.
But as
I'll find
we've said, there's plenty online nowadays, and more coming online all the time
Yeah.
about all this. So, and of course, if you don't know where to look, the folks at the library we'll help you for sure.
Yeah.
But start off by perusing this